Good morning and welcome to the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics, where the two fellows are in the room. Curtis Wilkie is up there on his perch, and Bill Rose is on the front row. My name's Charlie Mitchell. I'm the Assistant Dean of Journalism, and I'm glad to welcome you here this morning for a special presentation by a special guest. Terry Mattingly lives in Maryland and directs there the Washington Center at the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. He also would be better known in these parts because he writes a weekly column for Scripps Howard News Service that's available to more than 900 newspapers. His writing also appears in The Lookout, BeliefNet, Again magazine, and other publications, so he's multiple platform. He also leads the GetReligion.org website that critiques the mainstream media's coverage of religion news. Terry is a Texan. He double majored in journalism and history at Baylor University and then earned a master's at Baylor in church-state studies and a master's in communications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In addition to his work with CCCU, Mattingly has lectured at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, the Torrey's Honors Program at Biola University, at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, at Baylor University in Waco, and in other settings across the nation. Today, Terry adds the University of Mississippi to his prestigious list. We welcome you.
He left a key word out of that, which is, I will forever be a Texan, but I refer to myself as a prodigal Texan. I escaped in 1978 and really haven't been back. I mean, obviously love my family, love people in Texas, but I have felt much more at home in other parts of the country. And quite frankly, I intend to return someday to Tennessee. I think I felt more at home in the mountains of Tennessee than in any other place I've lived. This is my first time to Ole Miss. It was on my list of 5 places in America I had never been that I most wanted to go. So I am happy to visit, especially with the leaves in their current condition. Okay, here's what we're going to talk about today. The title, Faith in America, is a little bit on the broad side. What I would like to talk about today is why mainstream journalism has so much trouble trying to cover religion and trying to figure out the role that religion plays in the United States and around the world. This has been kind of the obsession of my life all through my career, starting in an event that happened in my sophomore year at Baylor University, the world's largest Baptist institution of higher learning. And I've been beating my head on that wall, dying on that beach, chasing that unicorn, whatever you want to say, ever since. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what I've learned today. I see the backs of a lot of Apple screens and stuff like that. I would like to let you know that I have mentioned to your faculty that in my classroom, which is 10 blocks from the U.S. Capitol on Capitol Hill, we have now banned laptops in lectures. And after we shot a very interesting video from behind the students without them knowing it, which allowed us to kind of look and see what was going on the screens of all the laptops in the room. But the ultimate trump card in my decision to ban laptops was when Apple banned laptops in their meetings, because they couldn't get anything done at Apple in the meetings if everybody was online surfing, tweeting, Facebooking, YouTubing, and all that other stuff. So it is not within my power today to ban your laptops, but I would think that especially if you're interested in religion and American life and or journalism, and I would think in a room with this name and in this location, you should be interested in both, I would urge you to just humor an old man and perhaps take some notes. A couple of years ago, to get started, I was invited to the Czech Republic to speak to the staff of Radio Liberty, previously known as Radio Free Europe. And now, of course, Radio Liberty broadcasts in all kinds of different places. And the people that I went there to speak to in particular were the men and women who did their Afghan radio transmissions. Yeah, Afghanistan. Every single member of the committee that I was facing was Muslim, a variety of different types of beliefs, within Islam. And it became very apparent to me within a few minutes that I had been brought to the Czech Republic to answer two questions, both of which I've been struggling with for about 30 or 40 years in the American press. Question number one, by the way, the man on the screen is the retired editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, and we'll get to him here in a while. So if you want to know what that face is up there, hang on. We have a video queued, and we'll be there in a minute. Question number one from the Afghan radio journalist. What does the word moderate mean when you put moderate in front of the word Muslim? Does it have any discernible meaning other than Muslims that Americans like? Or is a moderate Muslim the only content to that word being somebody that America approves of? Or is there any doctrinal or lifestyle or Muslim practice attached to that? Their second question is, why in the world do Americans keep calling Muslims fundamentalists? I mean, and that's a great question, since the word fundamentalist comes out of American Protestantism in the early 20th century with a bunch of people getting together. Just for curiosity, does anybody know where the movement that became known as the fundamentals of the faith, does anybody know where that began? I'll be shocked if someone does, but this is one of those questions where I'm not expecting an answer. But does anybody know? Where would you think the fundamentalists would start? I thought you were going to say Mississippi would be the stereotypical answer there. No, it started at Princeton. And the original documents to found the fundamentals of the faith movement were signed by Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, as well as Baptists and others. The movement is not quite what it's often portrayed in the press. So what does the word fundamentalist mean when you stick it in front of Muslim, other than Muslims we don't like? Moderate means Muslims we like. Fundamentalist means Muslims we don't like. That was their guess as Muslims from Afghanistan. I told them that they had it just about right. And in the American press, as far as I can tell, the word moderate, when placed in front of any religious noun, whether that's Baptist, Anglican, Methodist, or whatever, moderate means people the newspaper likes, and fundamentalist means people they don't like. I've seen very little to dissuade me of this. When you ask most people, in most mainstream journalists, what does the word fundamentalist mean? And they'll say, well, they're conservative, they take the Bible literally. That's the big phrase. They take the Bible literally. And I'll say, okay, that's biblical literalism. Or even biblical inerrancy, a phrase that some of you as Southerners might have heard if you're tuned in the Southern Baptist Wars. I said, but how are you defining that? And they go, it just means they read the Bible and they take it literally. And I went, well, the Pope says he does that, so is the Pope a fundamentalist? At which point, journalists say some interesting things, like they'll say, yeah, he sure is, which means the Pope is a fundamentalist Protestant. You see, you get the point I'm making. These words don't seem to have any content. And when journalists use words, the goal is to be as precise as you can. In fact, when in doubt, don't settle for labels at all. Why label people if you can actually listen to their voices, quote them, and attempt to describe the forces that drive their lives? Right? Isn't that what journalists do? It doesn't seem to be what many journalists do when they're talking about religion. We prefer instead to settle for labels, and in some cases we don't even apply the basic rules of journalism to covering religion. When I was in college, my mentor, a great journalism professor named David McCam, was the first person in my life who ever said to me, journalism and religion are having trouble. He said, religion is the single worst covered subject in the entire U.S. press. He said that to me in 1974, and I've had very little reason to doubt the accuracy of that statement ever since. In fact, I could make a case that it might be getting worse. So, why does the press struggle so hard with religion? I'd like to give you kind of a summary of what I've learned through my decades of chasing this white whale. There are 4 biases that shape this. Now, a lot of you, probably the first thing, when I asked this rhetorical question, the first thing you thought to yourself is, well, they don't handle religion very well because they're prejudiced against religious people. We'll get there. But I'll go ahead and not bury my lead here. It is my intent today to try to convince you that the bias of prejudice is the weakest of the 4 biases that are shaping the problems of covering religion in the American press. Okay? Just to let you know where we're going. Do we have anybody in here that sails? Has ever been at the helm of a sailboat? Anybody in here ever handled one of those things? We're using the term bias today the exact same way it would be used when you're talking about sailing. When you're trying to sail a boat in a direction that isn't directly with the wind, you have to tack it, right? To be able to get where you want to go. And what you're calculating is the bias of the wind, because the wind is going to want to take you in one direction, you want to go another. This is exactly the way I'm using the word bias today. We're talking about forces that shape the action of the press, mainstream press, when it's covering religion. Okay? That's how I'm using the word bias. I'm not presuming that this bias is automatically negative or prejudicial, although, like I told you, that's one of them, but we'll get there. Bias number 1. Bias number 1 is the bias of space, time, and resources. The way I like to think about this is it's very hard to cover a story if you don't have space to run it in, money to pay a specialty reporter to cover it, or any other resources that would allow that reporter to do the work they need to do. Okay? Space, time, and resources. In this particularly haunting, struggling time in American journalism, the simple fact of the matter, though, is that there is no painless way to cut a shrinking pie. And because of the advertising crisis we're in, we're dealing with even fewer resources than we were when I first came up with this grid years ago to try to describe these prejudices. So the decisions are getting more and more painful. And what you see when editors work with their declining resources is a very accurate and, I would argue, sad representation of the parts of American life they value the most. There has never been a harder time to argue for mainstream coverage of religion, even though, just stop and think about it, even in your lifetimes, young people, stop and think, what have been the biggest stories of your lifetime? Do words like Columbine and 9/11 and things like that come swimming out of the mists of your memories from your childhood? Do any of those things have anything to do with religion? An example of this, I have yet to see in the mainstream press a single article, other than a great cover story once at the New Republic, which is a specialty magazine, but I've yet to see an article that I believe adequately explains to the American people why the Sunni and Shia Muslims hate each other so much. Now, wouldn't you think this far into 2 wars in Iraq, not to mention the rest of the Muslim world, other parts of it, wouldn't it be pretty good at this point to understand why these people are massacring each other? What's going on in Damascus right now? I take this pretty seriously as a convert into Eastern Orthodoxy. The leader of my church is on the street called Straight in Damascus, and it's going to be surrounded by a war zone in a couple of weeks. Ask the Coptic Christians in Egypt if religion is a part of the story in Egypt. Yet we have declining resources, and a lot of editors are making decisions to apply even less of that money and time and newsprint, digital or analog, to the subject of religion. Bias number 2. Bias number 2 is the bias of ignorance. Now, there are people, the Freedom Forum and a bunch of others through studies of the years are convinced that this is the greatest bias that affects journalism coverage of religion. Simply stated in my catchphrases, if you want to try to get the short versions down, it is very hard to cover a story if you don't know it exists. One moment in my own career will always sum this up. I'm sitting in the newsroom at the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, and a member of the business staff comes over to my desk, and says, "We just got a press release that some organization is moving to Colorado Springs called Focus on the Family. Is that worth a brief?" After getting up off the floor, falling out of my chair over the fact that they were going to turn Focus on the Family moving to Colorado into a brief, I went straight to the editor and said, "You're going to look back on this moment, and you're going to decide that this is one of the 10 biggest stories in the state of Colorado in the entire late 20th century. If you want to talk about changing life in Colorado, changing politics in Colorado." And of course, for those of you who don't know what Focus on the Family is, and there probably are some people here, this, of course, at that point, James Dobson is like a towering figure in American radio and one of the loudest and strongest voices in conservative Protestantism in the United States. Literally, Colorado politics would never be the same. The problem, of course, nobody in the entire business staff of the Rocky Mountain News had ever heard of Focus on the Family. How do you cover a story if you don't know it exists? Bias number 3. Bias number 3 is the bias of worldview. Excuse me a second. And simply stated, the bias of worldview asks this question: how do you cover a story if you're not sure that you care it exists? What if in how you view the world within the matrix of your experience and your beliefs and your culture, what if your background shapes how you try to work in your field, how you try to work in journalism, and shapes what you think is important, what isn't important? I would go further and say what you think is tolerant, what you think is intolerant. And you end up with this matrix of worldview. I'm convinced that this is the big one. This is the bias that affects us the most. Now, some of you may, or you might run into this quote in your classes here at Ole Miss. There's a famous case where the Washington Post ran a news story, not a column, not an editorial, not an analysis piece. It ran a news story in which, as an unattributed, blunt statement of fact, they said the following, these words that live in infamy: "Evangelical Christians," said the story, "are, quote, largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command," unquote. Well, evangelicals across the United States were not amused. And I thought this was the age of the fax machine when this thing ran. I thought it was a particularly delicious irony that evangelicals all across America obtained the fax machine number for the main desk at the Washington Post and began faxing in their doctoral dissertations, page by page by page, and their diplomas and everything else. It turns out that if you look at the American public, evangelical Protestants are not that different education-wise from anybody else in America. Now, it's true they study different subjects in graduate school than many of the more liberal elites, but they're not radically different. Especially, they're not very different from the other people who live in their regions. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other parts of the country that are less evangelical than others. But suffice it to say that an evangelical living on Manhattan is probably just as likely to have a doctorate degree as anybody else living on Manhattan, especially within their racial group or their social class. Oh, by the way, the evangelical is highly likely to be Latino, African American, or Korean if they're living on Manhattan. By the way, the Washington Post did run a correction. The author of the story wrote a piece later in which they said they had meant to say that evangelicals are relatively poor, uneducated, and easy to command. That made everybody feel way better. Now, the problem for me related to worldview as it applies to journalism is summed up by another anecdote from the Washington Post in that same time period. The Washington Post decided that it needed a new religion reporter. Hosanna, as far as I'm concerned. And they put up the announcement so that members of the staff could see this first. A member of the Post, who will remain anonymous, took the announcement down, made a photocopy of it, and faxed it to the Washington Times religion reporter, who at that point was a brilliant woman by the name of Julia Dean, who is now teaching journalism, by the way, at Union University right up the road in Jackson, Tennessee. That would be an interesting person to bring in sometime here at the school for further talks on this kind of subject. She's an expert on the charismatic Pentecostal movement, is her background. And I'm sure that will be a part of her academic studies. Julia ran an item about this. This note that they posted up said, basically was, wanted new religion reporter. And it described what they were looking for. And the phrase that leapt out at Julia and leapt out at me was this: the ideal candidate for this job, ideal candidate, is not necessarily religious or an expert on religion. Did you get that? Ideal candidate is not necessarily religious nor an expert on religion. Now, the first half of that, the part about not being religious, I have no problem at all. I know fantastic reporters covering religions who are atheist, agnostics, every conceivable color of religion, or practice or not practice. One of the top reporters in the United States on evangelical life is a liberal Reformed Jew named Mark Pinsky. He's written an excellent book, which I would advise to be considered in your classes, called A Jew Among the Evangelicals, a guide to covering evangelical Protestantism. My Life with Evangelicals in Florida. Excellent book on beat reporting. Mark Pinsky's fantastic because he knows his subject inside out. He has learned to cover the people and the lives of the people that he's assigned to understand. So what offends me in that, in terms of the worldview of many journalists, is not that they thought the ideal candidate is not religious. I'm not struggling with that. It's nor an expert on religion. What's up with that? Can anybody imagine the Washington Post putting up a note, wanted Supreme Court reporter? The ideal candidate for this position does not have a law degree, is not interested in the law, and is not an expert on the law at all. Wanted NFL beat reporter. The ideal candidate doesn't like professional football, doesn't go to games, and doesn't know anything at all about it. Right? Wanted classical music critic. The ideal, that word ideal, can you tell how that grates at me? The ideal candidate doesn't like classical music, doesn't go to concerts, and hasn't trained themselves in any way to be an expert on this music. How many of you can picture the Washington Post posting up that announcement? What is it about the subject of religion that makes so many mainstream reporters get sweaty palms and decide to not just treat it like another subject in journalism? I mean, if you want to improve your coverage of religion, you do exactly the same thing you would do if you wanted to improve your coverage of professional football. Exactly the same thing. You go find yourself an award-winning, trained reporter who has demonstrated marketable, professional skills at covering pro football. You hire them, you give them a salary, and you give them inches in the newspaper, and you get out of the way. It even helps if the editors know something about the subject, right? It's journalism, stupid. Treat it like journalism. But there's something else going on here that we need to admit. And it's becoming more and more obvious what we're struggling with in terms of this worldview situation. And with that, I want to show you what, for me, is the most depressing piece of video I've run into in the field of journalism in the last, 40 years. This is an interview at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, with Bill Keller, who had just retired as the editor of the New York Times. I mean, he was literally out of the big chair just a couple of days, okay? He's being interviewed by the editor of the independent publication, the Texas Tribune, and the subject comes up of media bias. And we'll watch about 3 to 4 minutes of this. And this comes under worldview bias number 3. Okay, let's roll this thing. Get the lights off and roll it. Crank the volume way up, please.
Including readability, and that we care enough about those things that when we get something wrong, we try to go back and correct it. I think that's our brand identity. There's the question which you're going to ask, so I'll preempt it, which, isn't the New York Times also branded as a liberal newspaper?
Why do you hate America was going to be the way that I asked the question.
We have this guy called a public editor, and there have been 4 of them, and they're all guys. And the first of them, a guy named Dan Okrent, delightful guy.
Used to live here?
That's right, he did. Dan once wrote a column, the headline of which is seared on the minds of every person who's ever interviewed me. And the headline was, "Is the New York Times a liberal newspaper?" And the first line of the article was, "Of course it is." He then went on to explain the part that people forget was not that the New York Times was a democratic paper. I mean, yes, our opinion pages, the editorial page tends to be liberal. We have significantly more liberal columnists than conservative columnists.
Right.
The conservative columnists, are disavowed as apostates by the far right because they're in the New York Times. How conservative could they really be?
The New York Times idea of a conservative
Right.
is how they're always branded.
But right. There are token conservatives or our pet conservatives. But what Dan wrote was that we're liberal in the sense that, he didn't put it this way, but sort of in the sense that liberal arts schools are liberal. We have a kind of we're an urban newspaper. We write about evolution as a fact. We don't give equal time to creationism. We include. Sorry.
You may not be in the right state for that.
Yeah, right. And he's right down the street, isn't he?
Yes, maybe.
Okay. All right. I wonder what his science advisor. No, we'll save that subject for another time. We are liberal in the sense that we are open-minded, sort of tolerant, urban. Our weddings page includes, and did even before New York had a gay marriage law, included gay unions. So we're liberal in that sense of the word, I guess.
But he did not mean that you're liberal in the way that Fox News or the Wall Street Journal might perceive the Times to be biased.
No, he didn't mean that we, cut Democrats a lot of slack and persecute Republicans. And if you believe that we cut Democrats slack, I urge you to go ask Bill Clinton or
Anthony Weiner.
Or Anthony Weiner,
right.
Or either of the last 2 governors who were no longer governors of the state of New York.
And lately the president.
And lately the president has gotten some pretty tough.
So I'll ask you directly, and you can answer directly. Does the New York Times have bias in favor of Democrats or liberals?
Aside from the liberal values, sort of social values thing that I talked about, no, I don't think it does. It's a different question whether individual report. I mean, there are surveys that show that people who work in journalism tend to be predominantly liberal in their.
Let me underline what he just said. The New York Times, he said, is committed to being an American newspaper, the American model of the press, being as fair and accurate as it can, he says, in its political coverage. But when it comes to the worldview of the paper, it's urban, it's educated, it's tolerant, which of course implies that those who disagree with its point of view on these issues are what? Like they're from Mississippi, they're uneducated, and they're intolerant, right? I mean, or they're the opposite of the worldview that the Times assumes for itself. And when you're dealing with issues of culture, he says, no. Let me read you the exact quote again. Ask directly, if this is from a column I wrote on this a couple of years ago, ask directly if the Times slants its coverage to favor, quote, Democrats and liberals, he added, aside from the liberal values, sort of social things that I talked about. No, I don't think it does. So in other words, the Times expresses its worldview, its bias of worldview, in its coverage of cultural, moral, and social issues. Now, in other words, religion, essentially, and in particular, traditional forms of religion. Now, he has a straw man there in terms of creationism coverage. And of course, the Times defines the word creationist so broadly that, once again, the Pope is a creationist. But in effect, he's saying that on social issues, we're going to be biased. We're going to slant the news to fit our urban worldview. So if you were going to create a quick list of social issues from the years of your lifetime, students, think back 20 years. So what are we talking about here? I listed a few of them in my column. Let's basically say sex, salvation, abortion, euthanasia, gay rights, cloning, education issues, and a few others. Just those. Just those issues are exempt from the rules of journalism at the New York Times. Just those. And of course, those issues have nothing whatsoever to do with politics in American life, right? In the decades after Roe versus Wade, our political system has not been literally racked from time to time with political debates about this. And whenever there's an opening on the U.S. Supreme Court, the streets of Washington, D.C. on the Hill do not fill up with protesters on both sides of this issue because it's important to the American people still, decades later. So other than those social and religious issues, the Times is fine, but it slants its coverage on those. Worldview, folks. You're hearing what the new public editor of the New York Times worried out loud a couple of weeks ago when she said that she feared that there is now a New York Times community in the nation that now actively supports and enables the bias of the newspaper to continue. Camp number 4. Camp number 4 is the bias of prejudice. I said that my goal was to convince you that this is the weakest of the biases, and I really mean that. And I say as a person who's worked in mainstream newsrooms quite a bit and has had a relationship with the mainstream wire service now, my column is in its 24th year at Scripps. I have seen episodes of prejudice on religious issues in newsrooms. Very rarely have I seen it openly. But it does happen. And I wish that I didn't have to say this, but my rule of thumb is that the closer you get to issues in a bedroom, the more you are likely to see the bias and prejudice rear its head. As the great Catholic theologian Maureen Dowd once said, the problem with religious people in America is they're, quote, trying to repeal Woodstock. That in the end, all of these conflicts seem to boil down to where religion hits morality. I have no reason to doubt Maureen Dowd's views on that. In my own life, one episode I'd share with you involved, we were talking about the language used in covering abortion, which has been a controversial subject with journalists for years. You could take kind of a Time magazine approach, as many journalists do, and allow the movements to define themselves, at which point one side would be called pro-choice, and you would probably put that in quotes, and the other side would be called pro-life, and you would put that in quotes. But for decades, the mainstream press referred to the two sides of this debate as anti-abortion and pro-choice, thus giving one side of the battle the label that it wanted and giving the other side of the battle a label that it hated and felt was terribly narrow and did not define their whole agenda or their whole beliefs. Why did the press do that? I was having a debate once with a city editor at the Rocky Mountain News, and I've got to look down here to make sure I read this correctly. And I was arguing that I was going to settle for anti-abortion because at least it was literally accurate. My problem was giving the other side of the debate a term that didn't link the debate to abortion. So I suggested that we begin calling the other side pro-abortion rights, which is now the term of use in most Associated Press copy, not because I thought it, but because a lot of people thought it about the same time. And that's a better term, pro-abortion rights. It doesn't fit in a headline very well, but it's at least accurate. Well, this editor was not amused, and his quote was rather gripping, and I have let's say for a family audience, I will leave out some of the key elements of this quote. I went back over to my desk and wrote it down. And he said, let's see, pro-choice was accurate. He said the real choice was choice, not abortion. In the end, he said we should be even ahead to use pro-life. But then the city editor stepped in, minus a few descriptive words. Here is what he said. Look, the pro-choice people are pro-choice people. The people who say they're pro-life aren't really pro-life. They're nothing but a bunch of hypocritical right-wing religious fanatics, and we'll call them whatever the blank, blank, blank we want to call them. Now, I would argue that there's just a little bit of prejudice involved in that quote. Just a little bit of animus toward one side of the debate and not the other. Now, let me emphasize that this city editor is, by the way, one of the most brilliant and best journalists I've ever worked in my life. He also came from a Southern Pentecostal background. So he had kind of earned his stripes, so to speak, in terms of his prejudice from his perspective. He was a brilliant journalist and a great city editor. But on certain issues, he had buttons that could be pushed. And this was one of them. Bias of space, time, and resources. You can't run a story if you don't have money to pay for a reporter, ink to put on it, space in the paper to run it in. The bias of ignorance, of information. You can't cover a story if you don't know it exists. The bias of worldview. It's hard to cover a story if you don't care that it exists, if it's not a part of how you view the world. And that's the one I think is the most powerful. And finally, the bias of prejudice. It's very hard to cover a story if you don't basically respect the people you're trying to cover. So where does this leave us with Mr. Keller? Well, Keller has his own demons to wrestle with in another column once, a column in which he compared the Pope to Osama bin Laden. He referred to himself as a crashed Catholic and admitted that he was struggling with a lot of these issues because of, frankly, his own struggles, and he might have well implied hatred of the Catholic Church on a lot of issues. It was soon after he wrote that column, which ran under the headline, "Is the Pope Catholic?" that he was named the editor of the New York Times. Well, it was a tumultuous editorship, and in the middle of it all, there were some big scandals that rocked the New York Times in terms of its basic ethics and everything else. And they had to hire a firm to come in and do an outside study of the New York Times, its ethics, and how it did its work. And what I find interesting about this study is one of its major issues is the difference between editorial writing and news writing. In effect, they said, the New York Times is struggling to follow the American model of the press and be balanced and fair and accurate when dealing with all kinds of people. Who did they single out as the people the New York Times was struggling to cover based on their studies of the newspaper? Religious people, military people, rural, and Southerners. I would argue that to some degree, there are moral values and in some cases even religion involved in each of those subgroups. The New York Times is having trouble covering people outside its worldview. Now, there was a document that came back from the Times responding to this report, and I'd like to end by reading you a key part of it. I also endorse the committee's recommendation that we cover religion more extensively. But I think the key is that it is not to add more reporters who write about religion as a beat. I would agree with that, by the way. I think the cover is to be more alert to the role religion plays in the many stories we cover. Stories of policy and politics, national and local, stories of social trends and family life, stories of how we live. This is important to us not because we want to appease believers or pander to conservatives. Notice the assumption that religious equals conservative. But because good journalism entails understanding more than just the neighborhood you grew up in. Let me read that last part again. Good journalism entails more than just understanding more than just the neighborhood you grew up in. The author of these words, Bill Keller. A couple of years after that, one of my students in Washington went to a lecture by Bill Keller at the National Press Club. It was on C-SPAN. And the student stood up in the Q&A and read this paragraph to Bill Keller and asked how things were going in the New York Times' attempts to add intellectual and cultural diversity to its newsroom. Diversity is a big word among journalists for perfectly valid reasons. He read the quote. He ended with that exact phrase, reading it to Keller, and Keller completely dismissed the question and went to the next student question. Thank you very much. I think we have some time for Q&A if you want it. Thank you. Okay. I will tell you a little bit about the Washington Journalism Center. Now, first things first, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities is a network of about 120 liberal arts colleges and universities across the United States and now around the world. We have a lively affiliate in particular in Uganda. We run study abroad programs and off-campus study programs, and I'm the founder and the director of the Washington Journalism Center. So this is a program that's within an explicitly Christian worldview, but at the same time, it is very, very oriented to the mainstream press. It yields 16 credit hours, so it takes the place of an entire semester. And we have classes on Mondays and Fridays, and then you work full shift internships on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So you end up with do the math. I mean, most journalists don't work 8-hour days, and especially that's true when you're in an election season. Some of our students spent election night actually assisting in coverage at their publications. We only accept internships with smaller publications, wire services, websites, etc., that will allow you to do your own reporting and earn your own bylines. Because the most important thing that we want you to come back from Washington with is bylines that you can attach to your resume. And trust me, when applying for other internships or your initial jobs, editors will notice bylines with a Washington dateline on it. It can be rather significant. There's some question about whether students from state universities can get credit for this. We are working on that. We have an applicant for the fall semester coming from the University of Missouri and another interest coming from the University of Tennessee. So it might be hard for someone from Tennessee and Ole Miss to go to the same program at the same time. I understand that that could be difficult, but we would work on that aspect of it as well. So I have left information about the program with the dean's office here. There are also some students who are running around with brochures. I have, I think, 2 of the brochures left if someone would like to come nab one of those. Okay? Other questions?
Anything else? Well, we thank you very much.
Thanks.